Hiking has always been a source of peace and adventure for many of us. But sometimes, the trails we trust to bring us tranquility can turn into something else entirely. In this story, Derek takes us on a hike he'll never forget, one where the wilderness felt less like an escape and more like a warning. My name is Derek, and hiking has always been my escape. Whenever life got overwhelming, I'd throw on my boots and head to the trails. It's where I felt most alive. But one evening hike last fall made me realize just how fragile that sense of safety can be. There's a trail about 30 minutes from my house that I'd done dozens of times. It's not very long, a 3-mile loop through a dense stretch of forest. I knew it well enough to feel comfortable starting late in the afternoon, even though the sun was already beginning to set. The first half of the hike was uneventful. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I'd brought a flashlight, just in case, but I didn't think I'd need it. The fading daylight was enough to guide me. About halfway through, the trail split into two paths. One continued the loop back to the parking lot, and the other led to a small clearing overlooking a creek. I'd been to the clearing before and decided to head there for a quick rest before finishing the hike. When I reached the clearing, the air felt different. It was colder than it should have been, and an eerie stillness had settled over the area. The usual background noise of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling leaves, was gone. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat on a large rock near the creek, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I noticed something odd. On the ground a few feet away, there were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The prints were large, like a man's boots, but what struck me was how fresh they looked. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else on the trail. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. The trees around the clearing were dense, their shadows long and twisting in the fading light. A gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine, and I decided it was time to head back. As I retraced my steps to the main trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd never felt that way in the woods before. The trees, which had always felt protective, now seemed oppressive, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. About 10 minutes from the parking lot, I heard it, a soft, deliberate snap of a twig behind me. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. Turning slowly, I shone my flashlight down the trail. There was nothing there. I told myself it was an animal and kept walking, but now my senses were on high alert. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the rustle of branches, felt amplified. And then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I quickened my pace, practically jogging now, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The parking lot was just ahead, but the trail felt like it was stretching longer with every step. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the trail, partially hidden in the shadows. They didn't move. They just stood there, blocking my path. "Hey! Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Still no response. The figure remained motionless, their outline barely visible in the dim light. I took a step back, my mind racing. Should I run? Confront them? Before I could decide, they stepped off the trail and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I didn't wait to see where they went. I ran the rest of the way to the parking lot, not stopping until I was inside my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. But the trailhead was empty. I haven't been back to that trail since. Maybe it was just some stranger messing with me, but something about that encounter felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but it's like the forest itself didn't want me there that night. And whoever, or whatever, I saw, I don't think they wanted me there either. My name is Lucas, and I love hiking. There's something about being alone with nature that makes everything else fade away. But after what happened last year, I can't step foot on a trail without looking over my shoulder. It was mid-October, and the leaves had just started to turn that brilliant orange and red. I had planned a weekend to myself, heading to a trail I'd found online, a long loop through the forest that supposedly led to a beautiful overlook. The area wasn't too far from where I lived, but it was remote enough to feel completely isolated. I parked my car at the trailhead late in the morning. There were only 2 other cars in the small gravel lot, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and most people were at work. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and everything felt perfect. The first part of the hike was uneventful. The trail was well marked, winding through tall pines and oaks. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. I passed a couple coming back down the trail about an hour in. They gave me a polite nod but didn't stop to chat. After that, I didn't see anyone else. As I climbed higher, the trail became narrower and more rugged. The trees grew denser, and the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. That's when I first noticed it, a faint sound, like twigs snapping underfoot. I paused, thinking it might be a deer or some other animal. But the sound stopped as soon as I did. I brushed it off and kept going, but after another 10 minutes, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I stopped again and turned around. The trail behind me was empty, just a winding path disappearing into the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. No response. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. But as I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I'd hear the same sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, always at a distance, but never far enough to ignore. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached the overlook. It was as stunning as the photos had promised, a sweeping view of the valley below, the trees ablaze with autumn colors. But I couldn't enjoy it. That feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. I scanned the trees behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest. I decided to head back. The unease I felt wasn't worth staying any longer. As I started down the trail, the noises continued. They were closer now, more frequent. It no longer sounded like an animal. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, matching my pace. When I sped up, they sped up. When I stopped, they stopped. I've never been the paranoid type, but by this point, my heart was racing. I gripped the small pocket knife I always carried, even though I knew it wouldn't do much against, well, whatever this was. About halfway back to the trailhead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Off to the side of the trail, partially hidden by the trees, was a crude structure, a sort of lean-to made from branches and tarps. It looked like someone had been living there. Nearby, I spotted an old, rusted tin can and what looked like a pile of clothes. The area reeked of decay. I moved quickly, trying not to make noise. But as I passed the makeshift shelter, I heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I broke into a run, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The trail blurred as I focused on getting back to my car. The footsteps behind me were faster now, heavier. Whoever, or whatever, was following me wasn't trying to hide anymore. When I finally reached the parking lot, it was empty. The other cars were gone. My car was the only one left. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I threw myself inside and locked the doors, I glanced back at the trail. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know they were watching me. They didn't move. They just stood there, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I started the car and sped out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I never reported what happened. What could I say? That someone had been stalking me in the woods? It's not illegal to be creepy. But I've never gone hiking alone since. And every time I think about that day, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd been just a little slower. Or if I'd made the mistake of confronting them. I don't think I'd be here to tell this story. My name is Ethan, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, hiking became second nature to me. But one trip last summer changed the way I see those woods forever. I had heard about a trail deep in the forest that not many people knew about. It wasn't marked on any maps and was said to lead to an old, abandoned cabin. Stories about it circulated around town, rumors of strange noises and sightings. I didn't believe in any of that, but the idea of exploring something so isolated intrigued me. On a sunny Saturday morning, I decided to find it. Armed with a map of the general area, a flashlight, and some snacks, I set out early to make the most of the daylight. The main trail was well trodden, but after about an hour, I veered off onto a smaller path that quickly became overgrown. It was clear not many people had walked this way in a long time. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded until all I could hear were my own footsteps. After another hour, I began to notice subtle signs that I was heading in the right direction: old, rusted pieces of metal, a broken-down fence post, and finally, what looked like the remains of an old sign, its lettering too faded to read. Then I found it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, weathered and leaning slightly to one side. The windows were shattered, and the wooden door hung loosely on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. As I approached, I felt an uneasy stillness. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense that I was intruding. The air felt heavier, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Still, I couldn't turn back now. Curiosity pushed me forward. Inside, the cabin was just as dilapidated as the outside. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled of damp wood and decay. There was old furniture, a table, a chair, and what looked like a bed frame, all covered in a thick layer of dust. On the far wall, I noticed something strange, markings etched into the wood. They weren't random scratches but deliberate symbols, like circles and lines intersecting in intricate patterns. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but as soon as I did, I heard it. A sound from outside. It wasn't an animal, it was a low, steady whistle. The kind a person makes when trying to get someone's attention. I froze, my heart pounding. The whistle stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Whoever it was, they were circling the cabin. I turned off my phone's flashlight and crouched behind the table, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open. A shadow stretched across the floor as someone stepped inside. I couldn't make out their features, but they were tall and moved with an unsettling calmness. They didn't call out or look around. Instead, they walked straight to the markings on the wall and ran their fingers over them, as if tracing the patterns. I held my breath, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. After a few moments, they turned and walked back toward the door. But before leaving, they paused and spoke, their voice low and chilling. "You shouldn't be here." Then they were gone. I stayed crouched behind the table for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When I finally found the courage to peek outside, the clearing was empty. I bolted from the cabin, not caring about the trail or my bearings. I just ran. It took me hours to find my way back to the main trail. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting, and I was covered in scratches from the underbrush. I didn't look back as I drove away, and I haven't told anyone about that day until now. I still don't know who or what I encountered in that cabin. But sometimes, Late at night, I hear that whistle in my dreams, and it always feels like a warning. Thanks for watching this story. The woods can be unpredictable, and even the most familiar trails hold secrets we may not be ready to face. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unsettling stories. And as always, stay safe out there.